Our speaker tonight is Jim Brooks. He's from Clarksville. He's married, 3 children and 2 stepchildren and uncounted grandchildren.
I'd have to take my shoes off to count them.
He has a PhD from the University of Arkansas. He is a member of the Colonel Cyrus Suggs 1792 at Adams unit of the SCV, and he has also served as division chaplain. Jim, if you would.
I guess you want me back here so I can be heard better. Although I really don't like something between me and people. I appreciate y'all inviting me to come and speak to you tonight. I consider it quite an honor, and I was very impressed when I heard a few minutes ago that you all are a camp of 85 members, and that you all have just been growing and growing. And I was told, well, right now we're just holding our own, but I understand y'all are fixing to take off again in another growth spurt. Well, that'll be great, and an inspiration to other camps. The recession has hurt the SCV in Tennessee a bit. We've lost some members because they didn't have jobs and found it hard to, they had to cut corners in some places. But we're starting to grow again in the division. I was asked if I would speak on Abraham Lincoln, and I said, well, what particular aspect of his life or what about him would you want to know? Because on the Speakers Bureau, I've listed about 4 different topics related to Lincoln that I could speak on. As I told, well, I was talking, I know you all know Ed Butler. Most of you have probably met him because I'm sure he's spoken here. I was talking to Ed Butler this morning, and I said, he said, what are you speaking on? And I said, Abraham Lincoln. And I said, there is so much that you can say about Abraham Lincoln, and none of it is good. And though we laugh at that, that is true. Amen. We are taught, and I was taught in school, my teachers were pro-Confederate, but they did not know any better, most of them, and they let us think what the textbook said, that Abraham Lincoln was a good man and the war just sort of happened, and that he would have prevented it if he could. The opposite is actually true. As I think we all know, the war did not just happen. It was caused. It was contrived. And Lincoln had a great deal to do with causing it. And people would say, if I move this flag back, can y'all see me a little better? Because I don't think any of y'all can see through things. If you can, please meet me after the meeting and tell me how you do it. Lincoln was a Whig, and he went through life saying, I'm an old line Henry Clay Whig. Henry Clay, in order to get votes, he wanted to be president, though he never made it. John C. Calhoun once referred to him as a wicked, sinful old man. Probably because he liked to gamble and he liked to drink whiskey. Clay was a slave owner. He's sometimes touted as someone who didn't like slavery, but he owned a number of slaves. Clay was from Kentucky. Clay advocated what he called the American system. That the South would raise cotton, hemp, tobacco, but mainly cotton. The West, which at that time was the Midwest, would raise corn, other food substances, and that the Northeast would be a manufacturing area, and that all imports of manufactured goods into America would be taxed, and the money would be used to support the building of industry. The goods coming in to the United States from other countries would be taxed, and the tax would be high enough that we would want to buy, he said, American-made goods. Well, that sounds good until you realize all those American-made goods, 99% of them came from the Northeast. And it was the people in the South and the West who would be buying manufactured goods, especially in the South, from Europe. European ships came to the South to buy our cotton. Well, they didn't want to come empty. I know some of you all are businessmen or you've been in business, and if you're going to send a truck somewhere to pick something up, you know it would save you money if you can make a delivery or two at the same time. The European merchants sending their manufactured goods over, it was greatly to their advantage if they sent them over not empty but full of things they could sell to us, things that we in the South and people in the West did not manufacture on our own. Most of our iron implements, most of our manufactured goods came from Europe, especially from England, to a lesser degree from France and other countries. Clay said the West should grow foodstuffs and sell it to the Northeast, and then the surplus can be sold to Europe. Well, that meant the trade of what we call the Midwest would mostly be with the East. Clay said the South should also sell its cotton to the Northeast. Well, we weren't going to do that if we could get a better price from ships coming from Europe. Clay said we should all buy our manufactured goods from the Northeast. We weren't going to do that because as long as we could get lower priced, better quality stuff from Europe, and we were. Europe, England especially, was producing better quality manufactured goods than the Northeast, and they were lower priced. Those of you that have been in business, or if you know studied economics, you know that the more you can sell, you're guaranteed to sell something, you can lower your price. That's why Walmart does such a good business. They have all these thousands of stores. They can buy things to sell in a lot, and they can pay less per item because they're buying in bulk. If you and I go to the store and buy a gallon of milk, we're going to pay, I guess, $2.80 or something. But if we could buy 100 gallons or 1,000 gallons, we'd get it for a whole lot less. Buying from Europe, we got it for less because they were selling huge amounts to us. If we tried to buy it from the Northeast, it was a cheaper product. It was a cheaper quality product and a higher price. So they said, Clay said, slap a tax, a tariff, an import tax on manufactured goods from Europe, give the money to the federal government, so the federal government will make money, and also people will be more inclined to buy from the Northeast. If it cost an axe that I bought from a ship from England cost me 10 cents, and one I bought from New England cost me 20 cents, and the axe was already there, of course I'd buy it. But if you put a 50% tariff on it, or a 7%, you make what you do, you put a high enough tariff on the imported article that I will almost be forced to buy from the Northeast. What happened, though, is so Southerners and Westerners opposed a high tariff. One thing they found was that when a tariff got fairly high, the manufacturers of the Northeast, if the article from England cost $1 and the article from Massachusetts cost $1.25, they'd say, let's put a 50-cent tariff on it. The article from England now costs $1.50, but the article from Massachusetts no longer costs $1.25. Now it'd be $1.45, because they could raise their price and still undercut the Europeans. That's why Southerners always fought for a low tariff. Lincoln was a high tariff man. He said, I'm an old Henry Clay Whig. When he was campaigning for president, he reminded people over and over again, I'm a Henry Clay Whig. I'm for a high tariff. 7 states left the Union. They left because of agitation over slavery. But they did not leave because Lincoln was saying we're going to free the slaves. Lincoln said he had no problem. He said repeatedly, he said in his inaugural address, his first inaugural address, that he had no problem with slavery where it existed. The South was not a villain there. Most northern newspapers, as the first states began to secede, most northern newspapers said, the Democratic papers said, we're sorry to see them go, but that's their right. That's their privilege. A state can leave if it wants to. A voluntary association. We did not take a vow. Well, you know, you take the marriage vow until death do you part, and then there's no way you can break that vow. No way you can get a divorce, right? Of course you can get a divorce. People get divorces even for frivolous reasons every day. I knew a couple, the woman went to court and told the judge she wanted a divorce, and he said, on what grounds? And she said, just because I want one. And she got it. There was nothing in the Constitution that said a state can't leave. The Democratic and most of the, nearly all the Republican papers of the North said at the time of secession, it's legal. They have a right to go if they want to. The Democratic papers said, we're sorry to see them go. Do you know what the Republican papers said? We're glad to see them go. Because now, and I have some of it here in notes, as many of those Republican papers said, if we get the southern states, or even part of them, out of the Union, they're all Democrats. The Republicans will have a majority in both houses of Congress, and we'll have a Republican president, and we can run this country the way it ought to be run, the way we want to run it. In 1860, they voted to raise the tariff by about 40%. And President Buchanan, his next to the last day in office, he signed it into law. When Lincoln became, but then in the last, 3 or 4 weeks, 5 weeks before Lincoln took office, beg your pardon, just before the first state, South Carolina, seceded, the Republicans began to get concerned. When the Confederacy was formed, they got very concerned because the Confederate Congress passed a 10% tariff. And then Republican papers started saying manufactured goods from Europe that are, they didn't say better quality, but they were, that cost less than manufactured goods from the Republican states of the Northeast will be sold in southern ports at way less than our manufacturers are selling them for. And they said, we're going to lose all our customers in the South, and then people in the South are going to turn around and start selling those same items to our customers in the North, and we're going to lose our northern customers too. And Republican newspapers in the North started saying this can't be allowed. They noticed another thing too. 75% of the tariff money was collected in the South, the import tax. We bought most of the manufactured goods from overseas, so we paid most of the import tax. The money went to the federal government. For every dollar that 90% of the income of the federal government came from the tariff or the import tax or revenue tax. They called it all three things. 90%. 75%, actually 74, but 75 is easier to remember. 75% of that came from our ancestors, from Southerners. But when it came time to spend it, they spent 25% in the South and 75% in the North. And they said, after they finished paying for running the federal government, that's where the rest of it went. And they said, we're not going to have any money to spend in the North anymore, and we're going to have to cut the federal budget, slash it, if we let the southern states go, or the other alternative, raise taxes on the North. And the northern voters didn't want to do that. How many of you would vote with me to raise our taxes so that Washington can have more money to spend? Yeah. People weren't interested. So Republican papers started saying, if it's necessary, we've got to go to war to stop these states from leaving the Union, or those that had left to bring them back. The Republican Party ordered all of its spokesmen, its members of Congress, all of its prominent people, do not say anything at all about secession. This was early November of 1860. Over the next several months, one Republican leader in the Senate, Ben Wade, founder of the Republican Party, and one Republican member in the House. They had obviously been told they would be the spokesman. They each gave a speech in Congress. They said, this was before Lincoln had taken office, they said the President of the United States, the President of the United States has one duty which he must always perform. Do you know what it was? What they said it was? Collecting the taxes. And they said the man who is fixing to take over as president, Abraham Lincoln, these southern states, 7 have said they have left the Union. It doesn't matter if they say they've left. He's still got to collect the taxes in their ports. And if they resist, then they've gone to war with the United States, they've committed treason, and he's justified in raising armies to crush them, because the taxes down there have to be collected. Either that, but they didn't say the alternative, we raise your taxes, or we only have 25 cents to hand out instead of $1 for every dollar we were giving away. When Lincoln gave his first inaugural address, he was sworn in as president, and he gave his first speech as president to the American people and to the assembled crowds in Washington. He said in his speech, I have no desire, no inclination whatever to interfere with slavery where it exists, and I don't have the authority to as president. But what I do have the authority to do is to collect the revenue, collect the import tax. He said the federal government is required, and I forget if he said by the Constitution or what, he said the federal government is required to do 3 things in all states: have federal courts operating, have the mail running, and collect the taxes. And he said if the states that say they've left the Union don't want us doing those things, we can stop the mails and we can shut down the federal courts in the seceded states, but we will collect the tax. And he said, if this results in war, it's their fault. It's the fault of the seceded states if this results in war. The 2 major southern poets, I really had meant to talk more about Lincoln himself, but I can do that in the second hour. Lincoln, how long did you want me to talk? Lincoln, I didn't start timing myself, I meant to. And my wife's not here to do it for me, so she would watch the crowd and say, yeah, this is good, you know. We had the 2 major southern ports where most of the revenue in the country was collected were New Orleans and Charleston. Charleston was a lot closer to the north, and it was easier for the Federal Navy to get there. Furthermore, there was a fort in Charleston Harbor under the control of the United States Army. The Confederates and the governor of South Carolina and General Beauregard, who had been placed in command of the scratch force of Confederate troops at Charleston Harbor, asked the commander of Fort Sumter, Major Anderson, who was a Southerner from a slave-owning family from Kentucky, asked him to surrender the fort. He said, I have to hear from Washington. Well, the word from Washington was the fort will be surrendered. It will be turned over to the authorities, to the people, the authorities of South Carolina. It's just a matter of a little time. Delegates, Jefferson Davis picked 3 prominent men who were well known in Washington and had many friends in the U.S. government, sent them as private citizens to Washington, D.C. to meet with Abraham Lincoln to ask would he turn the fort over to the Confederacy. Lincoln refused to even see them, but Seward, his Secretary of State, assured them, said, I can't tell you this officially because you don't represent a real country, but unofficially he said, we're going to turn Fort Sumner over to the Confederacy. The governor of South Carolina, with the backing of the South Carolina's legislature, sent a delegation to Washington to ask, will you sell us Fort Sumner? They said, we know what its estimated value is, and we will pay you, the state of South Carolina will pay you that amount of money to turn Fort Sumner over to us and evacuate your troops. Why did they want to do that? Because no ship could enter or leave Charleston Harbor with Fort Sumner smack at the middle of the entrance of the harbor and its cannon trained on any ship that tried to enter or leave. Even before he became president, Lincoln sent word to General Scott, the commander of all the United States armies, to be prepared to reinforce Fort Sumner. He hadn't even taken office yet. And all this other stuff was going on. Lincoln, they always tried to excuse Lincoln from any blame by saying, well, his Secretary of State did this, his Secretary of War did that, General so-and-so did this, but the President knew nothing about it because it involved lying and cheating, and Lincoln was Honest Abe. Take a moment and refer to his reputation for being Honest Abe. It was a nickname. It's like the biggest boy, you got some grade school kids, and one of them's real big, maybe they nickname him Tiny as a joke. Honest Abe was a joke as a nickname. It was given to him by the other lawyers in Springfield, Illinois, because he would do anything to win a case. He didn't have a lot of education, but he was very sharp. He was a sharp country lawyer. He got by on his brains. And he also did not care if he was dishonest. That he would often brag at the bar after winning a case. He would brag to the other lawyers in Springfield about the dishonest things he did and the tricks he used to win the case. That's where he got the nickname Honest Abe. Well, here comes old Honest Abe. Who have you beaten out of some money today? We all know that the first mechanical reaper, it was first used to reap wheat, was invented by a Southerner, a Virginian, Cyrus McCormick. However, most of the wheat fields were in the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Nebraska, so he moved his business to Chicago, a railroad center, a hub of traffic for all the Midwest. He built his plant there, manufacturing his mechanical reaper. When it was first demonstrated, they had invited reporters to come, and they had 6 men with thighs who were known to be really good reapers. And he had his 1-horse-drawn mechanical reaper. And at the given signal, the 6 men started working, and his horse-drawn mechanical reaper began. At first, the 6 men were ahead, but they began to get tired, and the mechanical reaper kept going and kept going and kept going, and cut a lot more wheat. Everyone was very impressed, and once he began production, he began selling those reapers like nobody's business. But and he got a copyright on them. But a rival company, several rival companies sprang up who were selling reapers that were so near like his, he was able to sue and put them out of business because they had infringed on his copyright. One of those companies, though, got Abraham Lincoln and 1 or 2 other lawyers to be their attorney, and they fought when Cyrus McCormick sued and said, your Reaper is identical to the first version of to one of the early versions of my Reaper, and I've got the copyright on it and the patent. I've got the patent on it, copyright is for books. I've got the patent on it, and the patent shows what it looks like, and it looks like your Reaper. He thought he had him dead to rights. But one of Lincoln's cohorts found an elderly farmer. He was in his 80s. He was legally blind. I don't know if they had the definition legally blind, but he could hardly see, so we're calling him legally blind. Brought him in, and he had bought one of McCormick's first Reapers. And they brought the Reaper in. They brought it into the courtroom, and it was an old Reaper, and the blade on it was pitted and stained and had rust in it, so you knew it had been around a long time. And they brought this 80-some-year-old farmer in and said, sir, is this the Reaper that you bought from Cyrus McCormick, one of the first ones that he sold? And he said, I can't see it very well, but I know that it is, because these gentlemen came and got it from my farm. They ruled against McCormick and said the other company could continue selling the type of Reaper they were selling, because they said this Reaper, one of Cyrus McCormick's first Reapers, has a straight blade. The other company is selling one with a curved blade. McCormick's later model Reapers had a curved blade. His early ones did too. But they said, but the patent was on the early ones, and they said your early ones didn't have a curved blade, because here's one and it has a straight blade. And at the bar, at the saloon later, Lincoln said, you know how we did that? First of all, that's a very honest farmer, and we had people testify to his honesty, but he can't see, he's blind. And said, we took the blade that cuts the wheat off of his Reaper, it was curved, and we got another blade that's straight, and we soaked it in vinegar for a couple of weeks till the vinegar had eaten away at the metal, and it was rusted and pitted and looked really old. Then we put it on his Reaper. He testified in court that it was his. He had the paper where he bought it from Cyrus McCormick, and we defeated McCormick in court, and the other company can now sell the same Reaper McCormick's selling. That was on his day. He became President of the United States. Many papers in the North, and I was shocked when I found out that about 45% and possibly a majority of the northern people opposed the war. If you look at how many voted for candidates other than Lincoln for president, like in 1864, how many voted for McClellan? It was something over 45%, and tens of thousands were not allowed to vote. Polls were moved, polls were closed in the North. Prominent local Democrats were arrested and held in jail for weeks or months until the election was over, or told, we'll release you, but you got to promise you'll never endorse another candidate or engage in politics at all. Now, if you three people were, I hope you don't mind me pointing you out, we're not going to take you out and shoot you. If you three people were prominent local Democrats, say in Lexington, Kentucky, or Cincinnati, Ohio, and you had influence there, and a lot of people would vote the way you told them to, and you all had been getting up on the hustlings endorsing McClellan for president in 1864, or they knew you were going to. If all three of y'all were suddenly arrested and thrown in jail, or maybe prison, some were, and told, well, the election is 6 months away, you can spend 6 months in prison, or you can sign a statement saying, I will never endorse any political candidate again, or speak for any candidate, we'll let you go. Your influence is gone, and furthermore, people that would have listened to you, some of them will be scared. Because, well, I always listen to my local city councilman or our local mayor here, and she's in prison. So I don't think I'm going to listen to her, and she says she's not endorsing anybody anyway. If you take into consideration the people who might have voted Democrat but were not allowed a chance to vote, because polls were sometimes closed early where there were a lot of Democrats, It may have been a majority of Northerners that opposed the war. As secession began, Lincoln took over as president. The Republican leaders realized the only way we're going to get the tax money we want, we've got to use force. But the Northern people, most of them, at least over 45%, about 46%, according to the way they voted, didn't want a war. Now, if we ask, how many of you people out here are willing to go to war or send your sons or grandsons to war to raise taxes, to force people to pay more taxes? Nobody would want that unless they've been in the insane asylum. So it was played up as a war to save the Union. And you know how they did it. The Confederates fired on the American flag at Fort Sumter. They've declared war on us. And they're breaking up the Union. We've got to go to war to save the Union. And some people say, well, I don't believe that we should start a war to save the Union. Oh, but we've also got to go to war because we've been attacked. Aren't you patriotic? And young men rushed to the colors. Lincoln sent a fleet to Charleston Harbor to reinforce Fort Sumter. However, he told the American people the only thing on the fleet was a little food for our poor starving boys in Fort Sumter. The men in Fort Sumter under Major Anderson, they had been sending a boat ashore every day to the farmers market in Charleston and buying whatever they wanted. Until, this was because everybody was being told the fort's going to be peaceably turned over to the Confederate government. Then somebody leaked to a couple of New York papers that a fleet had sailed to reinforce Fort Sumter, and it included one warship, another warship to join it later, several armed revenue cutters, and a large contingent of men, artillery, cannon, and ammunition for the men in Fort Sumter. But Lincoln told the people of the North, they announced that it was leaked to them that a fleet had sailed to reinforce Fort Sumter. Lincoln told the Northern people there was nothing in it but a little food for our poor starving boys. But it was loaded with soldiers, with artillery, with ammunition, as well as more food. Then the Confederates stopped the garrison of Fort Sumner from going to Charleston every day to buy more food. So then they were running short on supplies. So in a sense, Lincoln's word became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Confederates found out they were being tricked, so they wouldn't let the fort's garrison buy food every day in Charleston, so they would start running low on supplies. When the fleet reached Charleston Harbor, they were supposed to have been joined by a second warship, but by accident, it got orders sending it down to Pensacola, so it wasn't there. The commander of the fleet sailed under sealed orders. He was told, when you reach Charleston Harbor, open your orders. With him was a man named Gustavus Fox. He had no rank in the military, and he had no rank in the government. He was just Lincoln's right-hand man, whom Lincoln had sent along to keep an eye on things and report back to him and see that his orders were carried out. The commander of the fleet, when the Confederates found out that the fleet was coming and they knew it was to reinforce the fort and that they had been lied to about the fort being peacefully turned over to them, they gave Major Anderson an ultimatum: surrender the fort within 24 hours. He said, give me till the morning of the 12th. And then he said, give me to the morning of the 12th, and then I forget exactly how he put it. If nothing had happened, he would surrender. Well, the morning of the 12th was when the fleet was supposed to be there to help him, the relief fleet. The Confederates said, no, we're not giving you that long. The night before, they opened fire on the fort. The fight was still going on. No one had been killed, but the bombardment of the fort was still going on. All the Union soldiers had gone down in bomb-proofs underground inside the walls of the fort. And though the brick fort, the walls didn't hold up good to rifled shells. They'd been built for solid shot, unrifled shells. The The men were underground and they had sand all around them, so the shells that hit destroyed the fort but didn't hurt anybody. The fleet arrived while this was going on. The commander opened his sealed orders and it said, when you arrive at Charleston Harbor, go in and give these supplies to the garrison of Fort Sumter. If, however, a battle is going on, sail in at once and attack the Confederate forces, attack their batteries. And Gustavus Fox said, you have your orders, go in at once and attack them. And the commander said, you and the president may want a war, but I don't want any part of starting a civil war. And he said, my orders, because Fox said, you have to obey your orders, they're signed by the president. The commander said, my orders say that when the second warship, the Powhatan, joins me, and I reach Charleston Harbor, I'm to go in and fight. The Powhatan has never joined us, so I don't have to go in and fight. And he refused to have anything to do with it. He said, you people are starting a war, and I don't want to be part of plunging this country into a war. We're told that Lincoln we weren't told it then, and when Warren Harding in, I think, 1923 was the main spokesman at the dedication of the Lincoln Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, he reminded everyone that the war was not fought over slavery. Lincoln said repeatedly, I just want to win the war and get the South, preserve the Union, but I'm not interested in fighting a war to free slaves. And he said all through the war, if the seceded states want to come back into the Union, they can keep their slaves. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, he said, we'll discuss letting them keep their slaves in spite of it if they come back in voluntarily. And as for the Emancipation Proclamation, people in the South, and especially in Europe, took it to be a war measure. And Lincoln said that it was. In 1864, I have their names and titles in my notes. Some prominent politician from, I think, Chicago, and someone else visited Lincoln, and they discussed, among other things, the Emancipation Proclamation. They wanted Lincoln to make the war, change it into a war against slavery, and he said, no, I'm not. He said, even the Emancipation Proclamation, which a lot of Northern people did not like me issuing, he said, it's helping us win the war. Because he said in it, did he say all slaves are free? No. Did he say all slaves in the states that seceded are free? No. He said all slaves in states that have seceded, where we haven't reconquered them, those slaves are free. And if we've conquered part of a state and part of it we haven't conquered, then the part that hadn't been conquered, those slaves are free, but the others remain slaves. That's what he said. He excluded Jacksonville, Florida, Pensacola, Florida, Alexandria, Virginia, all of the state of Tennessee, half of the state of Louisiana from the Emancipation Proclamation, because they had been occupied by his armies. So he said that slaves remain slaves there. His vice president of his second term, Andrew Johnson, from East Tennessee, Greenville, was a slave owner. He was also a Democrat. And Lincoln put him on the ballot to try and encourage Democrats to support his war effort. Johnson was a slave owner. Johnson's slaves weren't freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Tennessee voted to free its own slaves. And was that 65? I think it was 65. It might have been 60. I think it might have been 64, but it was after the Emancipation Proclamation. And they say that Johnson had some slaves in Washington, D.C. at the time, and he didn't free them even then. The slaves in Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky were not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation, and parts of Virginia or in Tennessee, and parts of Florida and Louisiana. And the President of the United States, Warren G. Harding, said, dedicating the Lincoln Memorial, slavery, the war was not fought over slavery. Lincoln said, I freed the slaves that I did with the Emancipation Proclamation because it helps us win the war. He said, all you people in these areas behind Confederate lines are free, and you can leave the farms and plantations where you were, where they were raising the food products that the Southern people and that the Southern armies needed, and go wherever you want to. But don't use violence against the people who have owned you or any other people around there unless they try to stop you from walking away from your jobs. Then you're free to use violence. In Europe, they said he is trying to incite a race war. He's trying to get the slaves to turn on their owners and the other white people of the South. Some of the Northerners said the same thing, and so did some of the Southerners. But it didn't work. In spite of the fact we're told now how horribly slaves were treated, they didn't revolt. And most of them didn't leave the farms and plantations. When Union armies came around, many of them did. But to my surprise, I found the reason a lot of them left was because the Union Army took all the food. There was nothing for them to eat. But they found if they followed the Union Army, they would usually get fed for a time. They would give them some army rations for a time. My grandmother, now, my grandfather's side of the family didn't own any slaves. And we all know what we're told now, only the slave owners wanted to fight. They were fighting for slavery. But if I asked for a show of hands as to how many people in here had ancestors in the Confederate Army that didn't own a single slave, didn't own a single one, it'd probably be every one of us. I had some ancestors who owned slaves, but I had a lot who didn't. But my grandmother Brooks's people, they lived in Fayette County in West Tennessee. They had a lot of slaves. And she told me the story that the black ex-slaves and the older white people, the older people, black and white, told her when she was growing up, how the Union soldiers came to their farms and would take every scrap of food on the place. And the women and children, the slave women and children, would get down on their knees before them and cry and plead and say, "Don't make us go hungry. Leave us some food." And she said they would tell her that most of the Union soldiers laughed in their faces. But a few of them were nicer and felt sorry for them and said, "We're sorry, we're only following orders. Because our orders are to take all of your food, make you go hungry, and then it's believed that the sons, husbands, fathers in the Confederate Army will desert and come home to see that their families are fed. And then we'll win the war." And that's why we're doing this. I've had other people, there's a gentleman in our camp, he said his grandfather, now I don't hate Yankees, but his grandfather as a young boy went to bed hungry so many nights because the Union soldiers had come and taken all their food. They didn't know why they were taking their food. I said, probably for the same reason my grandmother told me they took theirs. On her great-grandparents' plantation. She called it a farm, but back then, yeah, it was a plantation. Her grandparents, well, anyway, it was a big plantation. They had a slave on the plantation. He was about 18 or 20 at the time. He had been orphaned at an early age, had no relatives, and everyone had helped to raise him. So he was sort of like everybody's child. She said people told her he grew up to be a literal, truly, veritable giant. She said he was 8 feet 6 inches, and then she told, or 8'7". It was a little over 8.5 feet tall. And she said he was not tall and skinny, he was tall and big. He had the size to go with the height. She said people that remembered him told her, because he had moved away long before, said everybody was scared of him. He never hurt anyone, he never threatened anyone, but they were all a little scared of him. I mean, the slaves too, because they said he had this habit, in spite of his size, he could move as stealthily and quietly as an Indian. And you know how sometimes you're working or doing something and you feel like somebody's there watching you? She said people told her they would be working and all of a sudden they'd feel someone's eyes on them and they'd look up and he'd be standing there looking down at them. He never threatened anyone. He never hurt anyone. They were all a little scared of him. But the Union troops had been taking all the food. They took They hid what they could. They had one cow that had escaped, and they hid her in a honeysuckle patch down on the riverbank and put her in the middle of the honeysuckle patch, pinned her in, and she'd eat honeysuckle, and they'd milk her and give the milk to the sick people and the little children. They also they got the last of the chickens and hid back then and down there because termites' houses were raised up high off the ground on piles of rocks. So they put them under the big house, her great-grandparents' home, and tried to fence them in, and they'd throw them whatever if they could find to feed them. Well, the chickens were hungry all the time, and they're always trying to get out. That's all they had. They said one day, they always had lookouts. They teach the little black children to take turns to be lookout for the Union soldiers, the Federals, the Yankees. But they didn't want to offend the Federals or let on the... So they taught them to say, if they saw Yankees coming, "Praise the Lord, it's the Yankee soldiers come to set us free." There was one little black boy, and at one time I think she remembered his name, just like she remembered the giant's name, but when I was going to write it down, and she had been too long, she didn't remember his name anymore, and I didn't either. But they had one little slave child who wanted so bad to be a lookout, so finally they let him be a lookout. And on his lookout, here came the Union soldiers, and he shouted, "Praise the Lord, it's them goddamn Yankees come to steal our food." He sort of got excited and got his lines mixed up.
Can you go ahead and dish out some dirt?
On Lincoln?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I did get off track. I didn't intend to, but as the Spirit leads. But yes, dirt. Abraham Lincoln was the commander-in-chief, and whatever went on, people can lie and say he didn't know about it, he wasn't responsible. Yes, he was. Yes, he did. Lincoln, one of the things we were told about him was that he was a great Christian. Everyone who knew him well said that's a lie. There is a tiny little book about this thick. I found a copy of it once in the University of Arkansas library. It was something titled like Abraham Lincoln the Christian or something, written by a Presbyterian preacher. This preacher went to interview one of Lincoln's close friends and said, "I want information proving that Lincoln was a Christian." And the friend said, "Well, you'll never find it because he wasn't one." And the preacher said, and I hate to say it, but sometimes preachers can be crooked too. He said, "Well, when I get through with my book, he'll be one." And he put stuff in his book that all of Lincoln's friends and close associates denied, said it's not true. One of the things he said was, Lincoln was a secret Christian. He told me he didn't want anybody to know about his religious beliefs, but he dearly loved Jesus as his Lord and Savior, but not to tell anybody because he kept it private. And he didn't go to church much either for the same reason, and he never joined a church. But he told me he was really devout. One man, I think that's the same one, claimed that he had been Lincoln's preacher. But the problem is Lincoln was elected president right around the same time that he became the pastor of Mrs. Lincoln's church. Lincoln occasionally went with her to church, but they said when he did, he spent his time reading legal briefs or taking notes for a legal case or a political speech. Mary Todd Lincoln was a Christian. She said her husband was not. His two closest friends were his law partner, William Herndon, and Ward Hunt Lamont, who was a close friend from Springfield, Illinois, who went with him to Washington. Lincoln kept him as a personal aide and bodyguard and made him a U.S. Marshal. They knew Lincoln probably better than anyone, and they both said he was not a Christian, and there's no way you could claim he was. His law partner in Springfield, Illinois, said Lincoln only read the Bible when he wanted to mock something. He would go to in our law office or to an adjoining law office, which was bigger, and read a passage of the Bible to the young clerks and then mock it and attempt to tear it to shreds. He wrote a book which was supposed to be a mockery of something in the Bible, and it was so bad that his law partner who was a professed atheist, took it and burned it when Lincoln wasn't there, because he told Lincoln this would destroy your political career forever if it ever got out. When Lincoln was running for his first political office, which I believe was the Illinois State Legislature, there were 24 or 26 houses of worship in Springfield, Illinois. Not denominations, but local congregations. So we could say Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Church of Christ. They were all there. Shortly before the election, I think I read just days before the election, in 23 of those churches, the minister mounted the pulpit, came to the pulpit to say, do not vote for Abraham Lincoln, because he only talks about the Bible to mock it. He only talks about God to mock God. And he only talks about Christianity to mock Christians. So don't vote for him. And Lincoln lost. And Lincoln was seen afterwards poring over the records for Springfield, Illinois, the different voting precincts, and comparing them to churches. And he told someone, asked him, what are you doing? And he said, well, I figured out that I have lost this election because I failed to get the Christian vote. Most of them voted against me. He said, it'll never happen again. They'll never again be able to make the charge against me that I mock Christianity or I'm not a Christian. He never said he was a Christian, but he began to talk like the providence of God, all good providence. Well, that's not really Christian, but he could try to fool people that way. A letter was recently found, just in the last few months, that was written in 1866 by Lincoln's law partner. The law partner said, Lincoln was never an atheist, he was an agnostic. He didn't really know what was out there. Then he became a pantheist, which is like if you ever saw the movie Star Wars, and there's a force that you can draw on. Lincoln, but that's sort of pantheism. He said Lincoln came to believe that when you died, you became absorbed into this overall force that permeates the universe, and you cease to exist as a person. And this force is what he would call God, and it was just out there, and it was impersonal, and he didn't care about anything or anybody. Lincoln, and I'll tell you this, and I've had people say, oh, good, you shouldn't say that. Carl Sandburg, well, there are two books by Northerners on Lincoln. One is about this thick. I can't think of the man's name. He wrote Spoon River Anthology that I had to study in the 8th grade, and I thought it was the most boring thing I had ever seen in my life.
Edgar Lee Masters.
Edgar Lee Masters. Did you know he also wrote a biography of Lincoln? Masters was from a family of copperheads. His father, some years, Lincoln's law partner, Herndon, lived way into his 80s. Masters' father became Herndon's law partner. Herndon sat in the law office and Masters sat in the law office and heard Herndon talk many, many hours about Lincoln. He was already from a copperhead family. He considered Lincoln one of the most scurrilous creatures that ever crawled out from under a rock. That book, it was really venomous. He despised Lincoln so much. There is another book, biography of Lincoln, by Carl Sandburg, which I've never read. Sandburg spent years researching the book. Tell me if I go too long. Now in the 1800s and early 1900s, if you were considered, today we say gay or bisexual, if you were considered that, the most popular perfume for ladies was called lavender scent. And if you were considered gay or bisexual, they would say you can smell the lavender on you. Someone, a friend of Carl Sandburg's, asked him, said, there are all these rumors that Abraham Lincoln, as we would put it, his boat rocked both ways. Said, did you find any truth to that? Any evidence for it? And Sandburg said, well, I didn't dare put it in my book, but let me put it this way. There was a very strong hint of lavender on Lincoln. And I could be more specific because there are more specific things, but he was not what we're taught he was. And he started a war, and I'm concluding now, before people throw rocks. He was not the man we've been taught he was. The radical Republicans, Stanton and Stevens and others and Wade, who were his bitter enemies when he was president, because he wasn't as radical as them and wouldn't do what they told him to do. When he died, they wanted the Northern people to support them in grinding the South under their feet. They wanted to extend the blockade. They wanted to put a tax. The Constitution says you can't put a tax on exports. And it was done to please the Northeast that was exporting fish. So they put a tax in the South on what was growing in the field, the cotton that hadn't been harvested yet. It only lasted a year or two, but it was to get more money. They wanted the Northern people to support them in vindictive acts against the South. Some of the radicals said the South needs to be ground under our feet, their farms need to be confiscated, their property needs to be taken and given to loyal Northern citizens who served in the Union Army or supported the war. There was no sentiment for that in the North. The average Northerner was appalled at that. We fought the war to save the Union. We didn't fight it because we hated these people. They needed to get support, so they used Lincoln as a martyr. He was not a non-Christian, a liar, who had started a war. He became a saint. The Holy Lincoln, as one Northern writer said, since the days of Jesus Christ, no man has ever walked this earth who was as saintly as Abraham Lincoln. They fed this to the Northern people to try and make them vindictive, to make them angry. It wasn't any man who died, it was a saint, a wonderful man. And we're still reaping the benefits of it today. Because the South generally does not vote the way radicals today want us to vote. So that makes it a good reason to use Lincoln and the war and slavery to, I guess people might say it's political, to attack us today. As one man, one Northern congressman said, senator from Oregon, he said, the King of England wanted us to pay taxes and wanted to ride roughshod over our liberties, and we said no. So he closed our ports and he closed the port of Boston and inaugurated a war against us. This was just before the war began. And he said, now it appears that the United States representative from Boston, along with others in the Republican Party, want Lincoln to do the same thing to the South for attempting to exercise the rights that our forefathers gained from England. That's all I have to say. I enjoyed being here. We could have called it for dirt sooner, there was more.
Jan, would you please?